Welcome to the podcast summary of Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev's years in power were built on a very Soviet kind of trade-off. More stability, more predictability, and a lot less chaos at the top, but also a system that slowly hardened in place. Under him, the Soviet Union looked strong, armed itself heavily, and negotiated from a position of confidence abroad. At home, living standards improved in real ways, even as shortages, repression, and bureaucratic drift piled up underneath the surface. By the end, the order he created was so rigid that it could keep a fading leader in office, but couldn't really fix itself. After Khrushchev, Brezhnev's first big move was style as much as substance. Khrushchev had ruled in a personal, erratic way, and Brezhnev replaced that with Politburo consensus, or at least the appearance of it. For party elites, that meant something they valued a lot: security. No wild swings, no constant improvising, no feeling that your career might vanish because the boss woke up in a mood. That didn't mean Brezhnev was weak. By the late 1960s, he'd outmaneuvered rivals like Alexander Shelepin and Nikolai Podgorny, and eventually pushed aside Alexei Kosygin too. He did it through patronage, especially through the network, often called the Dnipropetrovsk Mafia, building loyalty in the old-fashioned political way. People rise because they're your people. Then in 1977, he removed Podgorny and took the head of state post himself, adding formal prestige to the real power he already held as general secretary. The economy under Brezhnev is easy to flatten into one word: stagnation. But the early years were stronger than that label suggests. Through the early 1970s, Soviet industry grew fast, and by 1973, output per person had climbed to about half of Western Europe's level and more than a third of the United States. For a system that had started from far behind, that was real progress. Living standards improved too. Income per head rose by about half during Brezhnev's rule, and consumption per head by an estimated 70%. People did get more goods, more social benefits, and a somewhat more comfortable life than before, even if comfortable in the Soviet sense still came with queues, cramped apartments, and the eternal mystery of what the store might actually have today. The turn came after 1973. Growth slowed sharply as the system kept favoring heavy industry, military spending, and centralized planning over innovation and consumer production. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, CIA estimates put annual growth at only around 1 to 2%. Shortages, low productivity, bad management, corruption, and even dependence on imported grain all pointed to the same problem. The system could preserve stability, but it couldn't adapt. That's why this period became known as the era of stagnation. Serious reform was avoided, short-term calm was protected, and the deeper damage kept accumulating until Gorbachev later called the whole thing inflexible. Brezhnev also rolled back much of Khrushchev's cultural thaw. This wasn't a return to Stalin's mass terror, but it was clearly authoritarian retrenchment: more censorship, more surveillance, and more repression. One early signal was the 1966 public trial of writers Yuli Daniel and Andrei Sinyavsky. That case showed the regime was ready again to criminalize cultural dissent, and it convinced many intellectuals that reform from within probably wasn't happening. By the mid-1970s, roughly 10,000 political and religious prisoners were estimated to be held in Soviet institutions. Some dissenters were even confined in psychiatric hospitals after being labeled mentally unfit, which is one of those details that tells you a lot about how power was working. And the KGB had penetrated most major opposition organizations, so even small resistance moved in a climate of constant pressure. Foreign policy under Brezhnev had a split personality, and he was perfectly comfortable with that. He pushed détente with the West while also building up Soviet military power at home. Defense spending jumped by about 40% between 1965 and 1970, and by 1982 military expenditure was roughly 12% of Soviet GNP. At the same time, there were major agreements. The 1972 Saltai Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty helped establish nuclear parity and put some limits on, especially destabilizing systems. The Helsinki Accords also mattered because they helped legitimize Soviet control over Central and Eastern Europe. So Brezhnev's version of détente was never about becoming less powerful. It was about negotiating from strength while keeping every option open. By the mid-1970s, many observers argued the Soviet Union had actually surpassed the United States as the world's strongest military power, even though détente did nothing to stop Moscow from backing revolutionary movements abroad. That assertive posture showed up most clearly in the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said, a threat to socialist rule in one communist country was a concern for all of them. In practice, that meant Moscow claimed the right to intervene. The clearest example was Czechoslovakia in 1968. Brezhnev ultimately ordered the Warsaw Pact invasion that crushed the Prague Spring. It preserved Soviet control, but it also badly damaged faith in reformist communism and helped push some Western communist parties toward Euro-communism instead. Soviet influence kept expanding in places like Vietnam, the Middle East, and Africa, but Afghanistan was where this approach turned disastrous. Brezhnev had initially opposed sending troops and expected a short operation once the invasion happened in 1979. Instead, the war dragged on for nearly a decade and fed both Soviet exhaustion and international isolation. What's interesting is that Poland showed the doctrine had limits. In 1980 and 1981, with solidarity growing to about 9 million members and East Germany pushing hard, Brezhnev still decided not to invade. Poland's own leadership imposed martial law instead, which tells you Moscow still wanted control, just without another direct military plunge. In Brezhnev's last years, his authority outlasted his ability to govern. After strokes, a heart attack, arteriosclerosis, heavy smoking, and dependence on tranquilizers and sleeping pills, he withdrew more and more from actual decision-making. But he remained the highest authority in the country, which created an unsettling gap between the image of leadership and the reality of it. That vacuum gave more influence to a hardline circle around KGB chief Yuri Andropov, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, and Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, especially on Afghanistan. By the end, some accounts suggest Brezhnev was so impaired that he could barely understand documents he approved. And still, the regime kept him in place because his death might have triggered a new power struggle. The stability he'd built had curdled into paralysis. Brezhnev's public image got stranger as his health worsened. He accumulated an enormous collection of decorations, including 4 Hero of the Soviet Union awards and even the improperly awarded Order of Victory, which made the personality cult hard to miss. His embellished memoirs about World War II and the Virgin Lands campaign even received official literary honors. At the same time, he had these oddly human, almost comic details attached to him, driving gifted foreign cars recklessly and delaying meetings to watch football. During the Gorbachev years, Brezhnev became the symbol of stagnation, but post-Soviet opinion has often been kinder. In a 2013 Levada poll, 56% rated him as Russia's preferred 20th century leader, ahead of Lenin and Stalin. That result makes sense if you think about what many people remember. Not dynamism, not freedom, but order, predictability, and a life that felt manageable, at least until the bill came due. Brezhnev's era held together for a long time, because it offered reassurance to the people inside it, especially the people at the top. It also left behind a useful warning. A system can look solid, powerful, even successful, and still be quietly teaching itself how not to change. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.